Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending the second session. Our presenter for this session will be Bill Moyer, and I will now turn it over to him. Okay, hold on a second. Okay, Bill, you should have received a request.
Okay, it's asking me to do some preferences stuff, so I'm going to do that.
Okay.
And okay, I'm going to have to rejoin because of the preferences thing, so I'll be right back, okay?
Okay. Okay, we'll be here.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Bill seems to be coming back into the meeting.
Okay, Eugenia, I'm back. Thank you for your patience. Hey, everybody. I think that I will be able to share screen here shortly. Let's see. I don't see that option just yet.
Okay, let me do it again since you signed out and came back in. I'll try it again.
Right.
Okay, just a moment.
Thank you.
Sure, no problem.
I really appreciate your help. So, everybody, Bakari Height had suggested last week that I join the transportation camp. This is my first time, so I'm on a bit of a learning curve. So, let's see. There we go. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And so the first thing I was going to show everybody, my name is Bill Moyer. I'm actually near Seattle on the West Coast, and I'm hoping you're seeing this this screen, and there's a video on there. And I'm just curious about whether or not you'll be able to hear the audio when it happens. So let's give it this is a 3-minute, approximately 3.5-minute intro into this project called Solutionary Rail. I got into transportation issues because in the Pacific Northwest, the fossil fuel industry and roads were basically engineering a massive increase in the use of our area as a fossil fuel corridor to Asia. And, you know, like most people, I didn't know very much about transportation and nothing about freight and rail. And in conversations with folks in railroad labor who were lining up on the other side of this issue, they challenged me and my friends to green a Northern Corridor concept modernization paper. And so we did that as a way of sort of embracing the opportunity to build alliances with labor. And my organization, Backbone Campaign, is more known for things like the things you see behind me, like kayaktivism and giant banners and puppets and stuff in protest. So let's see if this 3-minute video, I'll show it right before it ends and move to the presentation, see if this makes any sense.
Solutionary Rail. I'm
just going to pause it. Are you hearing that?
Yes, I do. I hear it.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Powered campaign to electrify America's railroads and open corridors to a clean energy future. Our vision is to electrify major rail corridors for faster, cleaner trains that provide a more reliable service for people and goods. We want to draw high-value cargo off of roads and back onto the tracks for highly efficient transportation and near-zero carbon emissions. And we envision opening rail corridors for the transmission of renewable energy, unlocking stranded wind and solar assets, which will not only power the trains, but also the communities they travel to. The United States has the largest economy in the world, yet its transportation infrastructure is overloaded, underfunded, and crumbling. Meanwhile, we are failing to provide solutions for the most pressing environmental and economic needs of the 21st century. The taxpayer-subsidized highway system built in the 1950s triggered an exodus of freight and passengers off of the trains and onto cars and trucks, accelerating the decline of U.S. railroads. Rail transport was forced to become increasingly dependent on moving cheap, heavy, and often dangerous payloads with longer, slower-moving trains making fewer stops, and abandoning regular service to the communities that they served. Now, ever smaller crews are forced to work without schedules, on call 24/7, which results in chronic fatigue that endangers workers and trackside communities. Meanwhile, semi-trucks clog ports, towns, and freeways, causing disproportionate wear and tear on our roads, killing thousands each year on freeways, and polluting the air with diesel exhaust. The rest of the world is overcoming these problems by electrifying their railroads. Many countries in Europe and Asia have made massive investments in publicly owned railroads that rapidly transport goods and people. Unlike national railroads of other countries, U.S. freight railroads are almost entirely owned and operated by private companies, maintaining their own tracks, unable and unwilling to make the large long-time investments for electrification and track modification. Solutionary Rail addresses these challenges through a tax-exempt, not-for-profit Steel Interstate Development Authority, creating a public-private partnership with railroads and other stakeholders to finance, build, and operate the electrification and transmission infrastructure. Our vision champions the needs of numerous stakeholders. For rail workers, minimum crew sizes, set schedules, and improved working conditions. For passengers, decreased travel times through higher speed rail networks. For farmers, increased capacity for bulk commodities and faster, more reliable service for moving perishable crops to market. For tribes, right-of-way justice, energy sovereignty, and export opportunities. For trackside communities, reduced air pollution from diesel exhaust. For green energy developers and rural electric co-ops, new transmission opportunities and access to distant customers. For the railroad industry, increased market share of high-value freight and long-term vitality. And for rural communities, an opportunity for access, economic renewal, and cultural vibrance. Solutionary Rail is a people-powered campaign for sustainable transportation and a clean energy future. And now we need you to help move this people-powered campaign forward. Join the team. Learn.
All right. So that is the 3-minute video that we did in 2017 after we put out a book in 2016 called Solutionary Rail. Now I'm going to go to the new slide deck we've been using and developing, and hopefully share that. So, you know, it seems to me that folks do quite a bit of work around justice, transportation justice issues in the space of transit, and then there's a lot of large green, big green organizations that do a lot of work around electrification, decarbonization in the area of EVs and such, but it doesn't seem like there's really adequate work happening in the space that relates to freight, and yet we know from when we do look at like the freight analysis framework and such that there's a lot of freight on our roads. So, you know, we had proposed in 2016 through the book and 2017 this like Steel Interstate Development Authority, thinking that that kind of a win-win proposal would be something that people would want, like the railroad companies would want, like Warren Buffett would want. But because Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company, owns BNSF Railroad that comes through the Pacific Northwest. And so you can download the book, a PDF of the book for free and stuff there, and I'll repost that if you need to. But what we found is they're actually not that interested in this, and that's kind of troubling because, especially in a moment right now where we're building talking about building an infrastructure for the next 100 years, and we're not really talking about our railroads, which have this incredible efficiency. So here's this is the new slide deck I did on this, and I've been trying to get the attention of members of Congress and Pete Buttigieg and such. So breaking down, obviously transportation is a huge part of the greenhouse gas contributors, right? That and energy. So in the transportation sector, it's about 23% is heavy duty vehicles, and a small percentage really is rail, but the long haul freight is actually kind of the hardest thing to decarbonize. But so anyway, here are the advantages of trains. I think most people can get this, right? They use a third of the energy because they're on steel wheels on tracks. Freight moved from roads to rails could reduce wear and tear costs, bridges and roads, reduces motor truck accidents, improves water quality, right? We've been hearing about the tire and brake stuff lately, more, around fish and such. Improves air quality and public health. My organization, Backbone Campaign, that is the sort of host of the Solutionary Rail project, works with the Moving Forward Network, which is an amazing coalition of mainly community-based organizations working to stop fight the diesel impacts on their communities, and obviously reduces CO2 emissions. So when that even mode shift, we're not even yet talking about electrification, even mode shift can have all these public benefits. So freight analysis framework, hosted at Oak Ridge National Lab. It uses a Bureau of Transportation Statistics. Freight Analysis Framework 4 has just recently been replaced by Freight Analysis Framework 5. But Freight Analysis Framework 5 isn't actually integrating ton miles or distance bands into its figuring. So I've been using Freight Analysis Framework 4, and it's basically 1 trillion ton miles of freight is traveling on our roads, and that on trips that are over 500 miles. So that's a lot of impacts, right? That's like hundreds of billions of gallons of diesel. That's like tens of billions of dollars in wear and tear, millions of metric tons of CO2, tens of thousands of premature deaths, thousands of freeway deaths, tens of billions of dollars in the cost of congestion. So it seems totally nuts that we're not, putting freight at the front of or really putting it, at least rail in the center, and of solving some of these problems. So one of the things we've been undertaking recently is the idea of creating a true cost calculator, and that's a little challenging, right? Because you've got all these sort of sets of data, and they don't all talk to each other. The EU, in their Shift to Rail program, has actually been making an effort to do this. They have this internalizing the external cost of freight handbook. That's quite a bit of a big study. And you can imagine, if you're in Europe, where you've got many countries, the data is even more fragmented. But note that the accidents, the pollution bans, the climate impacts of heavy gauge vehicles, are, the trucks, are significantly more impactful than those of rail. So we've got all of these different groups in the U.S., the TRB, Transportation Research Board, we got the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, we've got the SmartWay program in the EPA, USDA has been doing some visualization of FAF data, FAF, Oak Ridge National Lab, you've got the Texas Transportation Institute doing its congestion study, but we're not really putting all the dots together, connecting those dots to say, well, what are the true costs of our freight system? And so, one of the things that I was proposing to the USDOT is hey, why don't we, have us bring all these folks together and do a calculator? And in the meantime, we've been lucky enough to be working with Huajin Shi, the principal data scientist from the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, and to sort of start to get a tool, open source tool built. And it's just in its very, very, very early stages. So it's taking FAF data and it's starting to be able to make that create a visualization for that. And eventually it's going to take current state and it's going to break it down into emissions costs, safety costs, pavement damage costs, and efficiency benefits from mode shift. So this is, I think, a pretty important thing to understand the reality that we're in so that we can argue for the reality that we want. So to me, it also seems like it's really important that the mode shift of freight that's long-haul freight, traveling over 500 miles, should be a public policy priority. So that's why, in the beginning, we emphasized electrification of rail, and we're still all for that, and I'll get to that section. But we start with mode shift. Like, how do we get freight off of trucks and onto trains? So we did this thing called the Moonshot Mode Shift paper last year for the Select Committee on the Climate, sort of late in the process, and they really didn't do much with that. It felt like with long-haul freight, the House Climate Action Plan basically punted. So, but moving freight off of trucks and onto trains still feels like a super big, important priority. This is a picture of, by distance span, 100 to 249 miles to, over 2,000 miles. And our idea was, take a portion of that, and especially everything over 500 miles, and make it a public policy priority over the next 10 years to mode shift that off of trucks and onto trains. So how does that happen? Well, it seems like some of the ways that happens is with on-dock rail, this roll-on, roll-off technology that could be applied in certain places, working with short-line railroads and protecting their access to the main lines, and making sure that freight rail plans actually characterize who's using tracks and who's not, and how can we get shippers to and incentivize shippers to utilize rail rather than roads. So that's I'll just go through. These are just the pictures to support each one of those sorts of ideas, and I'm happy to share the slide deck so that you can look through this. One of the reasons I redid the slide deck is so that it wouldn't need a narrator, so it's a little funny that I'm narrating. But it talks about short-line railroads, it talks about state rail plans, and like I said, I will put this in the chat or in the Slack. The Nevada State Rail Plan is really cool. We interviewed the folks who did that recently at, if you go to solutionaryrail.org/interviews, you'll see a bunch of the things. We've interviewed Carlo Borghini from Shift to Rail in the EU, that program, Farmer from Iowa, environmental justice leaders from around the country, and including the folks who did Michael Sussman from Strategic Rail Finance, who did the recent Nevada State Rail Plan. And one of the cool things they did is, again, they mapped the industrial areas, and they so that the facilities with side tracks that are using them are the black dots, and then the facilities with side tracks that do not use them are the purple dots. And then you'll notice, ironically, we've got Tesla over here with this blue dot, and it doesn't have a sidetrack and is not using the most efficient and climate-friendly way of transporting goods. So still, electrification is super important to our project, right? Because it impacts communities. Electricity can also come from, there are lots of advantages of electric trains. Electric trains can run on renewable energy. That energy can cost less than diesel. In the long run, they're cheaper to maintain. They can use regenerative braking to reduce power consumption. And electric locomotives add capacity by a quicker acceleration and deceleration. And for goodness sakes, the rest of the world is doing that. This chart is from 2016, so it's even better than this now. And places like Switzerland, it's 100% electrified rail. So we understand that like rail is not a huge part of the carbon footprint, but with greater utilization, which is what we're pushing, like twice as much utilization, twice as much freight traveling there, it's going to have a greater impact, but also it impacts communities right now. Rail yards impact communities and the workers at the rail yards, and that's why we're such big fans of the Moving Forward Network and their zero emissions campaign and their work to electrify freight, electrify railroads, and help work with trackside communities to push local solutions for decarbonizing the freight system. Like here's an example of San Bernardino, the impacts of being near a BNSF rail yard, and so the public health, environmental justice rationale for an urgency for electrification is right now. We don't need mode shift excuses or whatever. It's impacting communities right now. So where to start? The rail yards, of ports and drayage, of course. I've always wondered why we aren't talking about making drayage a public a utility, instead of making it the most vulnerable workers and truckers and the dirtiest impacts. Rail yards, mainline railroads, and in Europe they're electrifying even like short distances for like $2 million a mile, less than $2 million a mile. And in the U.S., the railroads keep talking about it as it's a non-starter, and it's $4.8 million a mile. Well, that's not really the case. That number comes from papers from a long time ago that we're talking about lifting up overpasses and all kinds of stuff. So one thing we could do is not start with everything, but maybe StracNet. Maybe we consider rail electrification and climate like a national security threat. That would be one way to approach it. And then we're talking like 40,000 miles. Or we could take the most dense freight corridors and prioritize those, and the longest hauls. So maybe the northern and southern transcon from BNSF, maybe that's a great place to start. But in Europe, they actually have these trains that install the electrification. They do, I think, a mile or two a day, something like that. So people say, well, what about load? Why? Well, like you saw in the video, those who were here for that, transmission is part of the problem, solving the problem of the other big contributor to climate, which is energy. So you've got these sun-rich areas of the country, like the southeast, southwest, and you've got these wind-rich areas of the country, like the Midwest, right in the middle of the country. And yet we have these three grid systems that don't really connect, and people can't develop those renewable resources unless they have financing and unless they have transmission. So high voltage DC transmission is what we've proposed, and we think that it should go on existing corridors. That proposal did actually get into the House Climate Action Plan, thankfully. So access to transmission is a prerequisite, right? Transmission HVDC, high voltage DC, is way more efficient in doing that transmission with less loss. So there is talk of a national supergrid. So we think this could be the basis, the foundation of a national supergrid. There's a NOAA study that came out the same year as our book in 2016 that said we could get to 80% renewables if we just, by 2030, if we just had this HVDC grid. And I'm not going to read all the rest of the bullet points, but I'm going to paste the link to the presentation in the chat. Here's a model of what that HVDC transmission looks like. Basically, what you're doing is you're balancing the weather system. So some places it's windy, and it's not windy someplace else. That efficient transmission supplements. That'll also provide unlock those stranded assets in the middle of the country and in the Southwest. So there'll be more supply to provide that needed electricity to power the trains. And what I like doing is comparing the density of like this aspirational map. I wish it was still in play. The new aspirational map is less aspirational, but this is from Rail Passengers Association. But if you look at the sort of the density of those lines and the density of the lines for the transmission, you know, they kind of match up, right? This is another more recent map trying to do just 2 state pairs to try to overcome some regulatory problem, you know, hurdle. And then there's these other things to consider too, right? What are the who are either the other allies or the potential benefits and the ways to create this? So it's not a wedge issue, but it's a way of solving problems together in a time of great polarization. So you've got this this is a map of chronic rural depopulation. This is expanded passenger service, so people have access, and then this is the rural electric co-ops who could utilize these grid in order to transmission resources to export power and supply to the rest of the country. And then maybe we'd be reopening these stations, these communities that have been abandoned and no longer served by freight or passenger rail. Another key player, I believe, is the tribes. The tribes, for a number of reasons, I think should be at the table right from the beginning on this. And so we've been working with the Indian Land Tenure Foundation and in conversation with National Congress of American Indians as part of our learning process. And so this is a map of overlay of the Class 1 railroads, U.S.-owned Class 1 railroads, and the and Indian nations. Tribal nations here represent about 14 on the northern transcon and probably around close to a dozen on the southern. So they could also, when the railroads took that land, or when the U.S. took that land and gave it to the railroads, there are right-of-way justice issues that haven't been resolved that this would be an opportunity to resolve. And export of renewable energy rather than pipeline fights might be a really great idea. There were 29 tribes that asked for, did a brochure some years ago, including the Standing Rock Reservation, asking for investment in wind, because it's a very windy place. I was out there at Standing Rock, and it was extremely windy. So national security threat, like we saw, you know, it seems like the thing that happened recently with Texas is a national security threat. The logistic chains and increased like flooding and such, that's a national security threat. So maybe there's a way to repurpose some of this Pentagon spending that's unbelievable, right? And towards our infrastructure. So one would think that would be a big win-win-win, right? That's what we thought before when we proposed the Steel Interstate Development Authority, that would be a public-private partnership that the railroads would want to be part of. And so I'm not going to read the slide, but I'll paste it in. But they weren't. Why would they say no? The Class 1 railroads are basically captured by Wall Street now. And that's kind of a big problem if you actually want to have a conversation about freight, increasing capacity, electrification. But they are captured by lowering operating ratios and increasing stock prices and profits rather than increasing capacity and long-term vitality. So they're basically mining 170 years of investment for short-term profits. And they're making some really beaucoup profits. So, you know, $29 billion in profits for BNSF Railroad, $21 billion Union Pacific in a year. That's a lot of freaking money, because they're only worth altogether like $450 billion. So they make excuses like trucking is subsidized, but we're private. You know, they ignore the history of land grants or the bailouts when we, forgave them of their common carrier obligations around passenger service. We allow them to do, stop freight service to small towns. You know, they talk about level the playing field with higher gas taxes around trucks and make trucks pay their fair share, and we should totally do that. I think that's totally right. But it's also been studied that you can't really raise the gas tax enough to get the shift of mode over to trucks in the way we're talking about, because there's not enough service quality in the rail. So public-private partnerships are they like them as long as there's no strings attached. Well, that's BS, right? Because when the public invests, the public deserves something back. So I'm going to check the chat. I see some. Yes, I know Berkshire Hathaway is owned by BNSF is owned by Berkshire Hathaway. Yeah, that's right. And they continually say that electrification is a non-starter. They do these greenwashing campaigns around like electric battery locomotive that they'd never take to scale, and it doesn't make any sense anyway. Or LNG or CNG or methane. No, what's the new fuel cell? But those don't actually make really good sense when you weigh them against actually just regular electrification. And a lot of it feels like a way of keeping their long ongoing relationship with the fossil fuel industry intact and nursing that forward, and avoiding the kind of public-private partnerships that would create accountability. Experimental battery technology is cool, like the one with Wabtec, but it's really mostly cool as a way of supplementing where it's most expensive to do catenary, and take out the excuse that it's so expensive to do catenary by making them a battery hybrid with using catenary and battery. Sorry, okay. And so that's what I think is really what we ought to be doing. And I did a piece on looking at Siemens catenary electric truck highways and thinking about where do you put that, where do you apply that, and where do you apply catenary for trains. And I'm happy to share that document and get your feedback on that. So the Class 1 railroads published a thing in The Hill in January, Ian Jeffries, saying, you know, we're private, don't bother us, everything's cool, you just go and solve your problems, we're solving our own problems. And I thought that was like the Star Wars thing, you know, Obi-Wan Kenobi saying, these are not the droids you are looking for. And they are absolutely the droids we are looking for, right? Their idea of mode shift is so unambitious, it wouldn't, the net, when they lose, would be a net decrease in capacity once they lose coal. It's 25% of long-haul trucking over 750 miles is not good enough for the public interest. So that's why, you know, here I'm making the joke. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. They are precisely the droids we are looking for. So I'm going to try to wrap up here. I think the public's interest is in rail quality service that attracts capacity to carry 100% of freight over 500 miles, that freight and passengers travel on electrified railroads, and the railroads share right-of-way with the national supergrid. So, you know, how do we fight that? We could re-regulate the railroads. We can break up railroad monopolies. We could ask the federal government to invest in particular corridors like the Heart, you know, which I'll get to. Maybe there's probably lots of things we haven't thought of. We should first, for sure, instruct STB. Congress instructs STB, right? The STB doesn't make the policy, it enforces it, that railroads are common carriers, and we need to clarify what does it mean to be a common carrier in a 21st century, okay? Not, you know, in 1980 with the Staggers Act. What does it mean right now when we want to solve these really significant problems? They need to provide service. They can't be like making towns, small manufacturing farmers put together 52 cars in order to get access to a train. So that's about non-discrimination, which was actually the basis of the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887. So expand scope of rate complaint so that the STB can consider access to service as and force communities and shippers that are forced to use trucks as a rate issue, and explore separating infrastructure from operations like they do in other places. It's an open access system. Federal government could purchase tracks, rights of way from certain class 1s, use antitrust powers to break them up, or something else. Here's like the 4 corridors ideas. Like, okay, we started with the Northern Transcon. We did the northern route and the southern route. That's 4,400 miles. BNSF owns it. It's not controlled by Wall Street. Maybe we could buy it from BNSF. Here's the northern and southern transcon. This is an idea from a 2007 paper called the Heartland Fast Freight Concept. That could be a thing that we do first and bypass Chicago, so Chicago's not like bombarded with all these trains that aren't actually destined there. Or we could, invoke, really take climate as a national security threat seriously and do something bigger. So I'm going to just go swiftly through this. I would love to see that we address interdisciplinary problems with interdisciplinary solutions. Like, why not convene a summit of all of these cabinet members to connect the dots on these things, right? So the tribes at the center, playing a key role. Buttigieg, Granholm actually mentioned Solutionary Rail in a talk last year, which is cool. But when dealing with supergrid, Mike Regan at EPA, forcing electrification of railroads because of their diesel emissions, but also taking long-haul freight diesel emissions seriously, because there isn't really a plan to decarbonize those long-haul trucks. And then, as much as I don't like Vilsack or whatever, but, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is in charge of the rural electric system, and it's supposed to be serving farmers, right, representing farmers. So, and then Kerry, the climate czar. Let's tackle both of these climate impacts at one time. And so we've been investing years in trying to learn this stuff. And you all know, I'm kind of intimidated whenever I do this stuff because I'm always in rooms where people know way more than I do about transportation. So I met Bakari Height and was like, wow, I don't know squat about this, the work that you do, Bakari, and I listened to podcasts and whatever. But then I looked up the freight system in Georgia, and I'm like, whoa, you've got even more trucks on the roads than most places, and more impacts from Savannah and Atlanta. Maybe we need to bring the things we've learned together so that we can connect the dots. So one cool thing that happened recently is that the National Electric Manufacturers Association started a rail electrification council because of Solutionary Rail. We've had some influences and such. Blah, blah, blah. I'd rather get into the chat and question and answer, and this is my contact info. I will share all of that stuff and links in the chat or in the Slack, whatever works best here, and I'm going to stop the share. Stop screen sharing. And then can everybody turn on their video if they want to, or I think everybody has that control, right?
Yeah, they have that option to do so. Thank you so much, Bill, for that wonderful presentation. And as he alluded to, the floor is now open for any questions, concerns, or comments.
Yeah, so Fred says it's all about the money. Yeah, it's totally all about the money. And right now, right, there's more money going to be spent on transportation than we've ever seen in multiple lifetimes, right? So but the problem is, we've got all of these shippers, giant engineering firms and all these pet projects that are going to get in there. But do we have this overarching sense of a critique, a strategy for putting rail at the center? I'm not sure that we do, and that's why I think the people who are as intimately involved in transportation as you all are absolutely essential. I feel like now it's I got to stop knocking on the doors of Congress and USDOT and just go back to people like you and say, hey, maybe we can all lift these sorts of ideas up together.
Yeah, there's so many people lining their pockets on transportation. That's the problem. The people who make the decisions make money off their own decisions. If you were to look at it from a logical perspective and a functional perspective and get beyond the human greediness, it would change the whole dynamic to rail, transportation, bus, cars, the whole mobility and transportation and logistics system in the country and the world.
Of course. And that's why people power is so important. And that thing, my background is as an activist, as a social movement person, and so, that's why I think that making sure that we're building alliances in order to have the political power to start to have the voice to overcome all of those, really corrupting other influences.
Bill, Jim Katzenberger here. That was a very interesting presentation, and I will say that transportation camps usually don't get a lot of presentations around freight, and it's mostly people-oriented. So I think this is very interesting, particularly since value is created when people and product are in the same place, and you're speaking about half of that equation. If you could define what your desired future state is, could you just describe that for me?
Yeah, I would think that we want to rationalize the interstate road system, or part of this future state. One thing that I like to say these days is we want to rationalize and harmonize for greatest efficiency and public benefit our interstate highway system with our interstate railroad system, so that yes, we're going to use trucks, but let's use them in the right place. And then let's decarbonize all aspects of that system. So it's a decarbonized, rationalized transportation system. And as I'm growing in this process, obviously it has to be connective. And so the connectivity and the access, whether that be for passengers, so the realm that you all deal with, I think, transit stuff, so that the transit and to the rail is also as seamless as the drayage to the trucks, the ships to the trains, and that it be, I'm not sure if that's the final state, but decarbonized, so electrified, using as little battery as possible and as much catenary as possible, that it's rationalized in that it's using the most efficiencies it can, and it's serving the public good rather than Wall Street, and that it serves the other layers of public good related to the decarbonization of our energy system. Yeah. I don't know if that's totally adequate for you, but that's
it's not about me. It's about I'm trying to see where your head's at, what you view the future is. The follow-up question is, you said that we need some sort of strategy. Who do you think should be driving that activity?
Well, I wish it was the Biden administration, right? Wouldn't that be handy if the Biden administration had a full-on vision for this kind of decarbonization? But just like academic world, we see in government, everything's siloized, and it's hard for people to connect the dots on these issues. And I find that very frustrating. So I feel like we have to do a level, we have to do the lifting from the bottom up. And so I think that that part of the strategy is to make sure that we're listening to each other across sectors, so that we are the last 8 years for me has been about listening to railroad workers, to people in agriculture, to short lines, even if they can't say what they think because they're afraid of the class ones, to environmental justice organizers, and to tribes, to and now I'm starting to get a little bit more of an understanding from folks like Bakari around the issues around people like yourselves who are working in transit stuff. But I think strategy has to. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to reflect back what I'm hearing from multiple sectors, trying to identify where we're stuck, and then and hopefully reflect also the values and aspirations that you all are bringing. So I think it has to be bottom up. I think to create the pressure to overcome the moneyed interests, and then we that interagency summit would be like my dream of a strategy from the top down.
Okay, very good. Thank you. It's no, I think you got a high hill to climb, but I think it's important, and part of it is, and I think you touched on this earlier, is where are the wins, and for whom, right? Because you're in what my business we refer to it as a mixed motive environment. Yet you want to move move down the path. Right?
Yeah, I want to put rail, the efficiencies of rail, at the center of solving these problems and those existing corridors. And, it seems like we've already identified so many wins for rural communities, for EJ trackside communities, for, the public interest in its wear and tear costs, roads versus, et cetera, that the only place I don't see the winning are the people who honestly have won so much for so long. It's time that somebody else get a chance.
To Fred's point, that's where the resistance is going to become, because they want the stability. There's risk in the change. So whatever you end up doing, your plan has to mitigate those risks.
Yeah. Well, I think change is inevitable. And we're already experiencing the risks, right? They're losing coal. They're losing the railroad freight companies are losing mode share to trucks. The shippers are pissed because they're not getting the kind of service they want, and it's just they're trying to do less with less, and it's not. And we need the public interest is in more.
But they have no incentive because they keep getting influxes of cash.
And that's why I think that it's important that the STB and that we reprioritize and identify that the freight railroads operate in a privileged space, a monopoly space, and they need to be held accountable as common carriers to that privilege that they enjoy. And that if they can't live up to that privilege, we need to have some antitrust action to claw back control of those resources to make sure that those resources are put into the service of the public good.
So, question that occurs to me. So in Great Britain, a while back, they made the decision to basically decouple the infrastructure from the service.
Right.
And I'm curious on what your take is on that approach here for freight in America. Because I know it has trade-offs. So that strikes me as, because one of the struggles in terms of antitrust monopoly is that the infrastructure is so cost-intensive that it's hard to, you end up with, when you had lots of multiple routes competing, you ended up with a lot of redundant infrastructure like we saw in the Pensy Reading days, and that's not necessarily particularly efficient. So I guess I'm interested in your take on that approach.
Excuse me, before you answer that, Bill, before you answer that, I'm sorry. Thank you so much, Carl, for that question. But I just want to let you know that our session, as far as time-wise is concerned, has ended. We're over a couple of minutes. But, Bill, you can go ahead and respond to his question, and then we'll close out afterwards, unless someone else has some additional inquiries. Okay?
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. So, yes, I think that open access system is something that we should consider, and I think separating operations, or what they say, wheels from rails, is probably a good idea. I think that's probably the most reasonable way for us to, and we can make shareholders whole, right? We can buy that aspect of the rail business, and that's, I think, most likely how we actually get from here to there in terms of a rationalized, harmonized system. Yeah. So I was just trying to find I'm going to give the link to and paste it into the chat before we stop here, if that's okay. And then I really thank you for your attention and time. I'm honored that you stuck around through this, and I will put my email there, and my phone number in case there's any interest in if that's a better way. Thank you all very much for taking this time, and I very much appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to put one last link in the chat about assessing the application of batteries and catenary for trucks and trains. And all of this stuff, I really would very much appreciate your your feedback. So thank you all very, very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Great. Thank you. And thank you all for your participation and attendance. And I just want to let you all know that you're all welcome to join us for the lunch session in Chat Town. You can find the information, in Gather Town. You can find the information on your Slack platform. And once again, thank you all very much and have a nice day.
Thank you. Have a lovely day.
Mm-hmm.